Karma moves fast, but it hits entitled Karens harder. And today's 5 stories show exactly what happens when it catches up. From a Karen who thought the biggest brisket would guarantee her the championship, to a Karen who believed paying for a dive meant the ocean owed her a few extra minutes underwater. Hi, welcome back to another episode of Fatal Files. It was July 4th, 2017. In Grand Rapids, Michigan, dozens of competitors gathered at the annual Independence Day BBQ Championship as crowds moved between smokers and judges sampled entries. Like every year, local bragging rights mattered almost as much as the trophy. Paula Jennings was 52 years old and absolutely loved barbecue. She'd spent years winning local competitions, eventually turning that success into a catering business. After hearing people rave about her barbecue for so long, she didn't just take it as a compliment anymore. She took it as a fact. Even before the judging began, Paula joked that they might as well engrave her name on the trophy now. She spent the morning handing out advice nobody asked for and critiquing other people's barbecue like she'd been appointed head judge. Late that morning, one of the neighboring teams began drawing an unusually large crowd. Their homemade bourbon barbecue sauce quickly became one of the most talked about entries at the event, with spectators lining up for samples while several judges spent longer at their station than Paula thought they should. Let's just say Paula wasn't exactly thrilled that someone else was getting all the attention. Unfortunately, I wasn't wrong. Paula walked past their preparation table, brushed against it, and sent the container of sauce crashing onto the ground. She immediately claimed it was an accident, but nobody nearby seemed to buy it. The team managed to keep competing, though most of the sauce they'd spent days making was gone. That little stunt didn't end up helping Paula nearly as much as she thought it would. Meanwhile, Paula had another problem. Hoping to impress the judges, she'd entered an unusually large brisket that was taking longer than she'd expected to finish. As the judging window approached, she decided there wasn't enough time to wait. Rather than let it cook through properly, she sliced into it anyway and submitted it as it was. The gamble backfired almost immediately. When the judges cut into the center, they found portions of the brisket were still undercooked. Under competition food safety rules, her entry was disqualified on the spot. Watching the neighboring team she'd tried to sabotage continue receiving praise while her own entry was removed from consideration only made Paula angrier. Witnesses said she argued with event staff for several minutes before storming back to her cooking station as contestants began shutting down for the afternoon. Event volunteers had already started closing the cooking area and instructed everyone to leave the propane equipment alone, while staff disconnected and inspected each cooking station one at a time. Paula ignored them. Convinced her grill hadn't been getting enough gas all afternoon and had cost her the competition, she insisted she'd fix it herself. Paula disconnected the propane cylinder and reattached it despite repeated warnings to leave it alone. The connection wasn't fully tightened, allowing propane to escape around the fitting. As nearby staff shouted that they could smell gas, Paula repeatedly tried to relight the burner, waving them off and insisting she knew exactly what she was doing. On the final attempt, the accumulated propane ignited in a sudden flash fire. Paula was leaning directly over the grill when the gas ignited, taking the full force of the fireball. The flames also ignited parts of her clothing before nearby competitors rushed in with fire extinguishers. They managed to put the fire out within seconds while someone called emergency services. Paula suffered severe burns across much of her upper body and was transported to a nearby hospital. Despite emergency treatment, she died from complications related to her injuries later that evening. Fire investigators later found no evidence that the grill or propane equipment had malfunctioned. Their report concluded the fire most likely began after propane escaped from a connection that had been handled during shutdown. Witness statements from competitors and event staff all pointed to the same conclusion. Paula had been instructed not to disconnect or reconnect the propane equipment herself, but chose to do so anyway. Her death was ruled accidental. The neighboring team, whose barbecue sauce Paula had tried to sabotage, went on to win the championship, while Paula's entry remained disqualified for failing the competition's food safety standards. Being good at something doesn't mean you're always right. Sometimes that's the hardest lesson to learn. Over in Phoenix, Arizona, a woman ignored a safety barrier to save herself a short walk, never realizing several thousand pounds of merchandise were being lifted overhead. It was June 22, 2017, in Phoenix, Arizona. Summer heat shimmered off the pavement as shoppers hurried in and out of air-conditioned stores, trying to finish their errands before heading home. Julie Grace Hampton was 46 years old, a real estate agent who basically ran her entire life on a stopwatch. Showings back-to-back, phone calls between appointments, more showings after that. If you've ever known someone who sighs audibly at a red light, that was pretty much Julie's energy at all times. Co-workers used to say Julie couldn't stand in a line without eventually walking to the front of it. She'd cut through roped-off queues at the bank, argue her way past a hostess stand when a table wasn't ready, tell contractors their timelines were flexible whether they agreed or not. She was also a regular customer at the local home improvement warehouse and loved reminding employees how much money she'd spent there over the years whenever things didn't go her way. Julie genuinely believed loyal customers deserved special treatment, especially if it meant skipping a few inconvenient rules. That evening, she stopped by a large home improvement warehouse after work, just needing one last item before the store closed. But when she reached the aisle she needed, it was blocked off. An employee explained it would only be a short wait while a forklift positioned a heavy pallet onto the top rack. Julie reminded the employee that she shopped there all the time and had spent thousands of dollars at the store over the years. She insisted loyal customers shouldn't have to wait over something that would only take 5 seconds. The employee apologized but firmly explained the aisle would remain closed until the lift was finished. This is honestly pretty routine in big box stores, and most people would simply grab something else and come back a few minutes later. While the employee was momentarily pulled aside to answer another customer's question a few feet away, Julie saw her opening. She stepped around the barrier and walked straight into the closed aisle without a second thought. Here's the part that made this so dangerous. From that height, the forklift operator's line of sight was partially blocked by the load itself, so he had absolutely no idea someone had just entered the space directly below him. He was still positioning the pallet on the rack before it had been fully settled into place when the load shifted off-center. It doesn't take much for that to happen. An uneven pallet, a slightly loose stack, a few inches of imbalance, and gravity takes care of the rest. A ground employee spotted Julie walking into the aisle and immediately shouted a warning. The operator up top heard it over the sound of the mast motor and hit the controls to stop the lift, but the pallet had already tipped past the point where stopping the machine made any difference. Boxes and loose material started sliding off the edge first, spilling outward as the pallet tilted, then the pallet itself came off the rack, dropping about 18 feet down and outward from where it had been sitting. Julie was roughly 6 or 7 feet from the base of the rack when the load let go, close enough to be caught in the spill zone as everything came down. She had only a couple of seconds between the warning and impact, nowhere near enough to get clear. The heaviest portion of the pallet, several hundred pounds of packaged tile, struck her across the head and upper body and pinned her to the concrete floor. Employees ran over and started pulling boxes off her while someone called for emergency help within a minute of the load coming down. Responders arrived about 8 minutes later, but Julie's injuries, severe head trauma, and significant internal injuries from the crushing weight weren't something that window of time could change. Julie died from the injuries she sustained under the fallen load. The forklift operator and the rest of the floor staff were physically unharmed, though badly shaken. Surveillance footage from 2 angles later confirmed the sequence: Julie stepping around a posted barrier, walking into an active work zone, and the pallet coming loose seconds after. The investigation closed it out as exactly what it looked like: a preventable accident caused by her own decision to enter a restricted area. Nothing more. A closed door usually means come back later. A barrier means don't. Somehow, people still hear the same thing either way. Next, we're heading to Seattle, Washington, where one woman decided the best seat in the house was worth ignoring a restricted area. It was February 8, 2018, in Seattle, Washington. Guests dressed in suits and evening gowns gathered inside a beautifully restored historic theater for an annual charity gala. The ballroom buzzed with conversation as donors mingled over dinner before the night's fundraising auction and keynote speech. Kristen Ramsey was 41 years old and owned a boutique clothing store downtown. Running a small business meant she spent plenty of time networking, attending fundraisers, and rubbing shoulders with the same people year after year. Somewhere along the way, she started started believing her name alone should open a few extra doors. By the time dinner was served, Kristen was already annoyed. Another local business owner had been seated at the head table near the stage while she was placed several rows back. Certain she'd earned better treatment, she complained to event staff, who politely explained the seating chart had been finalized weeks earlier. Needless to say, she wasn't happy about it. Maybe I've been going to charity galas all wrong, but I always thought the point was to raise money, not fight over the seating chart. As the evening went on, Kristen noticed an upper balcony overlooking the theater. It offered one of the best views in the building, but guests weren't allowed up there. Earlier that afternoon, maintenance workers had discovered one section of the decorative railing shifted slightly under pressure during a routine inspection. The balcony had been closed until engineers could examine it after the event. Kristen walked over anyway and asked if she could go upstairs. An event volunteer apologized and explained the balcony was closed for everyone's safety. Kristen argued for another minute before walking away, clearly frustrated. She lingered near the back of the ballroom for a while, glancing up at the balcony every few seconds as if she still couldn't let it go. A few minutes later, as guests were being ushered into the ballroom for the keynote speech, the volunteer stepped away to help direct people to their seats. Seeing her chance, Kristen slipped through a nearby service doorway leading to the upper level. The balcony was quiet now. Kristen walked toward the center railing overlooking the stage below. From up there, she could see the entire ballroom, and for a moment, it probably felt like she'd finally gotten the spot she thought she deserved. She pulled out her phone and tried to fit the stage, the audience, and the chandeliers into a single photo. To get a better angle, she leaned farther over the decorative railing and rested more of her weight against it. At first, there was only a faint creak, then another. Before Kristen had time to react, the railing shifted outward beneath her. She instinctively reached for it, but the weakened section tore free from its anchors. Kristen fell nearly 20 feet into the theater lobby below. Guests heard the sharp crack of wood and metal, followed by a heavy impact that echoed through the entrance hall. For a second, the room went completely silent. Then, people started screaming as several guests rushed toward her while others backed away in shock. Event staff immediately called emergency services while security cleared the area so paramedics could reach her. She was still alive when they arrived and was rushed to a nearby trauma center with severe head, chest, and internal injuries. Despite emergency treatment, she died a short time later. Investigators later determined the balcony itself had remained structurally sound. The failure was isolated to the decorative railing, which had partially separated from its original anchors, the same issue maintenance staff had identified during their inspection earlier that day. Engineers had already scheduled the railing for repair once the gala concluded. Security footage also showed Kristen entering the restricted area only minutes after being denied access by event staff. Her death was ruled accidental. The night could have ended with a little disappointment. Instead, it ended in tragedy. Seeing so many of you come back every week genuinely means a lot. If you'd like to support the channel, subscribing is the easiest way to do it. Now back to the video. Down in Nashville, Tennessee, a woman decided a 2-minute detour wasn't worth her time, never realizing the shortcut led straight through an active high-voltage work zone. It was September 12, 2015, in Nashville, Tennessee. Late summer heat still hung over the city as utility crews spent the afternoon replacing aging electrical equipment at a neighborhood substation beside a busy shopping center. Temporary barriers and cones redirected pedestrians around the work zone, while bucket trucks and service vehicles moved in and out through an open-access gate. Large warning signs made it clear the area beyond was restricted to authorized personnel. Melanie Benson was 39 years old and worked as an office administrator. She hated unnecessary walking and considered even the smallest inconvenience a waste of her time. If someone told her to take the long way around or wait her turn, she'd usually start looking for a shortcut instead. Rules rarely impressed her if she couldn't immediately see the point of it. Around midday, Melanie parked at the shopping center and started walking toward the entrance, only to find the usual sidewalk blocked off by cones and temporary fencing. Utility workers were directing pedestrians along a short detour around the substation, while crews finished replacing equipment inside. It would have added maybe 2 or 3 minutes to the walk. Certain there had to be a quicker way, Melanie headed toward the open vehicle gate the crews were using to move trucks and equipment in and out of the site. A worker stopped her and pointed her back toward the pedestrian detour, explaining the area was closed while electrical work was underway. Melanie immediately grew irritated, asking what they could possibly be fixing that justified blocking the sidewalk. She complained that the government was always wasting taxpayers' money on projects that looked perfectly fine and insisted that, as a taxpayer, she had every right to walk wherever she wanted. The worker calmly explained the substation was undergoing essential electrical upgrades and repeated that the area was off limits. Most people would have accepted the short detour. Melanie walked away, but only for a moment. As another utility truck pulled through the gate, the worker stepped aside to help guide it into position. Seeing an opening, Melanie slipped around the temporary barriers and continued through the work zone toward the opposite side of the property. To Melanie, it was just a shortcut across a construction site. To everyone working there, it was an active, high-voltage hazard. One thing most people don't realize is that you don't have to touch high-voltage equipment for it to be dangerous. Around energized electrical systems, getting too close can be enough, which is exactly why utility crews take those safety boundaries so seriously. Melanie had no idea that what looked like a simple shortcut was about to become the biggest mistake of her life. The substation was divided into clearly marked work areas, with temporary orange fencing surrounding the energized equipment that remained in service while other sections were being upgraded. Several workers immediately realized where Melanie was headed and started shouting for her to stop. Before anyone could reach her, she'd already crossed the clearly marked safety boundary around the energized equipment. She kept walking, apparently convinced the workers were being overly cautious. Then, without warning, a powerful electrical arc suddenly jumped through the air. The flash was almost instantaneous, bright enough that several workers instinctively turned away as a deafening crack echoed across the site. The force of the arc threw Melanie backward onto the gravel, sending dust and loose stones into the air around her. Melanie was thrown backward onto the gravel. Everyone's first instinct was to run to her, but they couldn't. Entering the energized area would have placed the workers in the same danger, so they first had to contact the utilities control center and confirm the equipment had been completely de-energized. Those few minutes felt much longer as the crew waited for confirmation, knowing there was nothing they could safely do until the area had been made safe. Once the power had been shut down, workers reached Melanie and began first aid until paramedics arrived. She was transported to a nearby trauma center with catastrophic electrical and blast injuries, but died a short time later despite emergency treatment. Doctors treated extensive electrical burns along with severe internal injuries caused by the arc blast. Investigators later confirmed the temporary barriers, warning signs, and pedestrian detour had all been properly installed before work began. Security footage showed Melanie walking around the barriers through the open vehicle access used by utility crews only minutes after a utility worker had directed her back toward the designated pedestrian detour. The incident was ruled an accidental death. This story is a good reminder that just because you can't see the danger doesn't mean it isn't there. Last but not least, in Key Largo, Florida, a woman thought paying for a dive meant she could stay underwater a little longer than everyone else. It was August 4th, 2018, in Key Largo, Florida. Warm, clear water. The kind of visibility divers travel from all over the country to see. And a small group had booked a guided reef dive for the afternoon. Nothing advanced, just a relaxed trip out to one of the popular sites offshore. Jillian Owens was 37 years old, a financial consultant who'd flown down for a few days to unwind. She ran her whole vacation like a line item, mentally tracking what everything cost and whether she was getting her money's worth out of it. She was the type to argue a hotel room rate down over a slightly late checkout, or complain to a waiter that her appetizer took too long to justify the price. If she paid for a 2-hour dive, she wanted 2 full hours in the water, and nobody cutting things short early was going to talk her out of that math. It's a mindset that works great in a boardroom, and considerably less great 40 feet underwater. The dive started out normal, the group descending together, checking gear, following the instructor along the reef while she pointed out coral formations and a few fish weaving through the structure. About halfway through, the current started picking up, gradually at first, then enough that visibility began dropping as sediment stirred off the seafloor. The instructor recognized the shift and started signaling the group to begin their ascent early, cutting the dive short for everyone's safety. Most of the group followed without hesitation, but Jillian lingered near a formation a little longer, waving off the signal, figuring she had a few more minutes in her before she needed to surface. By the time she looked up again, the water around her had gone hazier, and there was no sign of the group's fins or bubbles anywhere she could see. free. What was she even planning to do down there? Negotiate with the current. By the time she turned to catch up, the group had already moved off with the current, and the drop in visibility meant she couldn't see more than 15 or 20 feet in any direction. She swam toward where she thought they'd gone, but the current was pushing at an angle she hadn't accounted for. The reef features she'd been using to orient herself were gone, replaced by open water and drifting sediment in every direction. And every few minutes she checked around her, only to find herself further off course rather than closer. She checked her air gauge and realized she had less than she'd planned on, the extra swimming having burned through it faster than a normal ascent would have. Low on air and unable to locate the group, she made the decision to surface directly rather than search any longer. Her hands were shaking as she checked the gauge a second time, and her breathing had already sped up past what her remaining air could really support. From that depth, a controlled ascent should still be slow and steady to allow expanding air in the lungs to escape safely. Panicked and running low on air, Jillian bolted straight to the surface instead of making a controlled ascent. She broke the surface roughly 90 seconds later, already struggling, gasping for air, and unable to keep herself fully afloat. A crew member on the dive boat spotted her within a couple of minutes, and the boat maneuvered over to pull her aboard. At first, she was conscious but confused, complaining of chest pain, difficulty breathing, and dizziness. And within another few minutes, her breathing had become labored enough that the crew radioed ahead for emergency responders to meet them at the dock. The trip back in took close to 20 minutes, during which her condition continued to worsen. Jillian died from complications related to the uncontrolled ascent, consistent with an arterial gas embolism caused by pulmonary barotrauma. Investigators determined that the rapid ascent likely caused expanding air in her lungs to enter her bloodstream, creating air bubbles that blocked blood flow to vital organs. When her equipment and dive logs were reviewed afterward, everything lined up with what witnesses described. The instructor had signaled the early ascent, the rest of the group had followed it, and Jillian's own dive computer showed she'd surfaced well outside the safe ascent rate after several extra minutes on the reef. The case was closed as an accident tied directly to that decision. At the end of the day, the instructor was never the one keeping score. The current was, and it doesn't care what you paid for the ticket.